The sun hung low over the Arizona plains, a molten coin sinking into a sea of gold and rust, when Jacob Raynor tightened the reins of his horse and stared toward the distant Apache settlement. For 20 years, the land had known him as the quiet cowboy who kept to himself. No wife, no kin, just a weathered hat, a scarred heart, and the wind for company. He had built his ranch from the red dirt up, hammering each nail with calloused hands and the memory of a love he lost long ago. The settlers called him Silent Jake, not because he was unfriendly, but because he carried something unspoken in his chest, something broken that words couldn't mend. That evening, as he rode back from the river, he spotted smoke curling above the ridge, a thin gray whisper against the deepening sky. It wasn't from his land. It came from the Apache camp beyond the creek, where few white men dared to go since the last treaty. But Jacob had never been a man to measure danger by color or creed. He'd fought beside Apache scouts once, years ago, during the border raids. He knew their courage, he knew their sorrow, and he knew one woman among them he could never forget, Taya. He hadn't seen her in nearly 16 years, not since that night beneath the canyon moon when she told him they couldn't be together. "Our worlds don't touch, Jacob," she'd whispered, her eyes shimmering like obsidian glass. "If they do, one of us will bleed." He never argued, just kissed her one last time and watched her walk back into the shadows of her people. Since then, he'd lived half a man's life, working, drinking, staring out across the empty fields as if the horizon might one day bring her back. But now, something about that smoke, steady, desperate, pulled at his chest like an old wound reopened. Without thinking, he spurred his horse toward it. The path was rough, littered with stones and thornbrush, and by the time he reached the camp, dusk had folded itself over the desert. The Apache dwellings, simple brush shelters and clay huts, glowed faintly from the firelight. And there she was, older now, her long black hair streaked with silver, but unmistakably Taya. She was kneeling beside a fire, tending to a young boy who lay wrapped in a worn blanket. When she looked up and saw Jacob, she froze, her dark eyes widening with something that wasn't surprise but memory. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice both gentle and guarded. Jacob dismounted, hat in hand. "I saw the smoke. Thought someone might need help." Taya hesitated, then sighed. "It's not help a white man can give." Her gaze drifted to the boy, whose small chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Jacob stepped closer. "He's sick," she nodded. "Fever. 3 days now. I've tried herbs, prayers, everything I know. The medicine trader won't come this far anymore." Jacob knelt beside the child, his rough hands trembling slightly. "I can ride to town tonight," he offered. "Bring a doctor by morning." But Taya shook her head slowly. "The doctor won't come for us. Not for Apache blood." Her voice carried no bitterness, only the tired truth of someone who'd lived too long with injustice. Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd seen that truth before, in burned villages and forgotten treaties. He looked at the boy again, noticed the faint freckles on his nose, the shape of his chin, something about it tugged at him. "What's his name?" he asked. Taya hesitated, then said, "Nathan." The name hit him like a hammer. Nathan, simple, strong, familiar somehow. Jacob swallowed hard. "He's yours." Taya looked into the fire. "Ours," she whispered. The world seemed to tilt. For a moment, Jacob couldn't breathe. "What are you saying?" he managed. She looked up, tears glimmering in her eyes. "He doesn't know you exist," she said quietly. "He never has." The cowboy froze. The words slammed into him with the force of every lonely night he'd ever endured. His chest burned. He stared at the boy, the soft curls, the faint dimple near his mouth, and suddenly it all made cruel, perfect sense. 16 years ago. The way she left without goodbye. The silence that followed. "My God," Jacob breathed. "He's my son." Taya nodded once, a single tear tracing her cheek. "I wanted to tell you, but it would have ruined him. You were hated here. We were hunted. I couldn't give him your name, not without taking his life from him before it began." Jacob's eyes filled. "And you thought that was mercy?" he said hoarsely. "To let me live all these years without knowing I had a son." She closed her eyes. To let him live. There was no anger in her tone, only pain. Jacob looked at Nathan again, the boy twisting weakly in fever dreams. "I can help him," Jacob said finally, his voice trembling but steady. "I'll get him medicine." He stood abruptly, ready to mount his horse, but Taya caught his arm. You'll never make it to town and back before dawn. And even if you do, no doctor will ride out here. Not for us. Jacob turned to her, eyes blazing. Then I'll bring the doctor here if I have to drag him. He rode harder that night than he had in 20 years. The wind cut like knives, sand stung his face, and coyotes howled from the ridges, but Jacob didn't stop. Every hoofbeat was a prayer, every breath a plea. By the time he reached town, the moon was sinking behind the hills. He burst through the saloon doors where the only light came from a few flickering lamps. "Where's Doc Harlan?" he barked. The bartender looked up, startled. "At his house, I reckon. But he ain't gonna." Jacob was already gone. He pounded on the doctor's door until the man appeared, bleary-eyed and cross. "What in hell's the matter, Jake?" "There's a boy sick out near the creek. Bad fever. Needs you now." The doctor frowned. "That's Apache land. You know I can't." Jacob grabbed his collar, his voice low and fierce. "You're coming, Harlan. He's a child, damn it. You took an oath." The doctor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Within minutes, they were on horseback, racing back through the dark. When they reached the camp, the boy's breathing was shallow, his lips pale. Harlan worked quickly, mixing powder and water, forcing it gently between Nathan's lips. Taya watched silently, her hand gripping Jacob's. For hours, they waited as the first hint of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. Then, finally, the boy stirred, opening his eyes. "Mama," he whispered weakly. Taya fell to her knees, sobbing with relief. Jacob turned away, tears burning his own eyes. Harlan packed his things quietly. "He'll make it," he said. "He's strong." He looked at Jacob, then at Taya, and something in his gaze softened. "I'll bring more medicine tomorrow. Nobody needs to know where I've been." Jacob nodded his gratitude. When the doctor rode off, the camp fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Jacob crouched beside Nathan, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "You got a brave heart, son," he murmured. Nathan smiled faintly. "Who are you?" Jacob hesitated. Taya's eyes met his, pleading, uncertain. "A friend," Jacob said softly. "Just a friend." The boy nodded sleepily, drifting back to rest. Jacob stood slowly, his chest aching. "He doesn't know," he said to Taya, his voice breaking. She shook her head. "Not yet. Will you ever tell him?" She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher. "Someday. When he's strong enough to understand that love isn't always allowed to live in the open." Jacob stayed a few days, helping repair huts, fetching water, mending fences. The Apache men kept their distance, wary but not hostile. They'd heard stories about the quiet cowboy who once rode with them long ago. Each night, Jacob sat by the fire watching Nathan sleep, memorizing the curve of his face, the sound of his laughter when he was awake, the way his small hand clutched his mother's. When it came time to leave, Taya walked him to his horse. "You gave him a chance," she said quietly. "And you gave me a reason to breathe again." Jacob smiled sadly. "Guess I always did love you, Taya. Maybe I always will." She touched his cheek, her eyes full of everything they could never have. "Then ride knowing he carries your strength, even if he never carries your name." Jacob rode away without looking back until he reached the ridge. From there, he turned and saw the camp below, a tiny flicker of smoke against the vast desert. A woman and a boy standing side by side, waving faintly in the wind. He lifted his hat in silent salute, his heart both heavy and whole for the first time in years. As he disappeared into the distance, the land seemed to breathe again, the same land that had once divided them, now quietly binding them in memory. In the years that followed, people spoke of the cowboy who brought a doctor into Apache country when no one else would. They said he was a hard man with a soft soul, that he'd ride through hell for what was right. Jacob never spoke of that night again, not even to the drifters who shared his campfires. But sometimes, when the sun set low and the wind carried the faint cry of an eagle, he'd smile faintly and whisper, "That's my boy." And miles away, on the other side of the hills, a young Apache child would grow strong, brave, and kind, a boy who'd one day hear stories about a lone cowboy who helped his people and never asked for thanks. He would never know that the same man shared his blood, his stubborn heart, his quiet courage. But perhaps that was enough. Because sometimes love doesn't need names or promises, it just needs to exist, quietly, fiercely, across the spaces between worlds. And on a cold evening many years later, when the boy, now a man, rode into town seeking medicine for others, he'd pass by the small grave beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of Jacob Rayner's ranch. He'd stop, not knowing why, and remove his hat. The inscription was simple: Jacob Rayner, a man who rode for others. And as the wind whispered through the grass, the young man would feel a strange warmth in his chest, a connection he couldn't name but somehow understood. He'd smile faintly, the way Jacob once did, before turning his horse toward the horizon. The sun would catch his face just so, and for a fleeting moment, it would be as if Jacob's spirit rode beside him, proud and unbroken, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, a testament to love that endured not through possession but through legacy.